Hey guys, tonight we begin with the bizarre, slow-motion collapse into death of Henry VIII, the Tudor titan whose life was filled with wives, wars, and very questionable decisions involving axes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the velvet corridors of Whitehall Palace, past stained glass saints and tapestries depicting victories long since irrelevant. At the end of the corridor lies a figure once hailed as England's golden boy, and boy, has the shine worn off. You've arrived at the end of Henry VIII's reign, a royal body that's more furniture than flesh, more myth than man, and currently outgassing softly under several layers of fur-lined denial. Let's rewind, not too far, just enough to remember who Henry once was. The early Henry VIII didn't shuffle. He galloped, he jousted, he wrote poetry and composed music and, crucially, looked amazing in tights. The kind of man who made foreign ambassadors write home about his thighs. 6'2", athletic, charming. The human embodiment of Renaissance ideal. At 20, he looked like a walking painting. At 50, he resembled the painting's neglected canvas, half buried under gravy stains and bad decisions. What happened? Well, life happened, or more accurately, a collection of self-inflicted wounds, indulgences, and refusals to acknowledge the laws of physics. Somewhere around his mid-30s, Henry fell off a horse during a jousting tournament. Not just fell, he was crushed. Briefly unconscious, likely concussed, possibly concussed again later. Historians still argue whether that fall changed just his health or also his mind, but one thing is clear. The injuries never healed. His legs swelled, opened, leaked, and never quite closed again. By the 1540s, Henry had ballooned into something more symbolic than sovereign. Weighing in at over 300 pounds, almost entirely concentrated around the midsection, he carried not just the weight of a nation, but a buffet table's worth of bodily regret. Royal tailors were desperate. You can picture one standing there, tape measure in hand, muttering, "We're going to need more codpiece." His last suit of armor was measured at a 54-inch waist, which makes you wonder whether it came with built-in hinges and wheels. He was no longer the man on horseback. He was the man in the chair, lifted into place by other men who probably needed therapy afterward. And yet the paintings, oh, the portraits, still showing the virile king, broad shoulders, sharp eyes, that confident stance. They were essentially Tudor-era Photoshop. No one dared paint the puce. But beneath those courtly images lay an open secret. The king was rotting, publicly, with budget, his feet wrapped in velvet, his ulcers pulsating beneath embroidered breeches. The smell? A mix of medieval shame and medicinal hope. Courtiers learned to master the art of subtly holding their breath while smiling. And make no mistake, he was in constant, wretched pain. The kind that makes you wince just imagining it. His joints ached, his legs throbbed, his stomach bloated like a bread oven gone rogue. He couldn't ride a horse, he could barely walk. Even standing felt like an Olympic event, minus the applause and with significantly more pus. Physicians did what they could, which in Tudor England mostly meant bleeding, burning, and praying aggressively. His pain was treated with opiates, herbal concoctions, and regular lancing. Yes, lancing, as in someone had to slice open his legs daily and drain them. And you think your job's bad. His physical condition wasn't just a medical issue, it was a political one. You don't want the world knowing that the supreme head of the Church of England can't climb stairs without a 5-man assist. So the king stayed seated, sat in judgment, sat in anger, Sat until the cushions probably developed Stockholm Syndrome. At public appearances, everything was stage managed. Short walks, long chairs, political discussions interrupted by very loud sighs of pain that doubled as warnings. I'm uncomfortable, and if you suggest Protestant reforms right now, I will excommunicate your head. Meetings were kept short, banquets long, conversations delicate. If Henry winced, you changed the subject. If he smiled, rare, you thanked the heavens and pushed your luck no further. But the irony is, for all his grandeur Unwind, Henry's final years were defined by shrinking options. Not physically, he was still taking up more space than ever, but mentally, spiritually. The glow of Renaissance brilliance was now the dull ache of decay. His court had become a pageant of careful silences. Every time someone entered the room, they were really entering a theater of managed decline. You imagine a courtier entering his chamber with important documents only to be stopped mid-step by the smell. That thick, sweet, sour scent of infection and defeat. The sort of aroma that makes you wonder whether incense could commit treason just by failing to cover it. And the thing is, Henry knew. He wasn't unaware. He was vain, not blind. He saw the faces of those around him, the way they flinched ever so slightly, the quick darting glances at his legs. He heard the whispers behind velvet curtains, and it enraged him, made him unpredictable, dangerous. He'd smile at you, then exile your cousin. Approve a law, then have the person who drafted it executed. Pain has a way of sharpening power into paranoia. So this, dear listener, is where you find yourself tonight. Sitting quietly at the edge of Henry VIII's bedchamber, listening to a man in a golden robe grumble his way through chronic agony. You smell lavender, urine, wine, and bandages. You hear the hum of court musicians outside the door, trying to distract visiting nobles from the royal winces. You watch as the king reaches for a goblet with trembling hands, not from fear but sheer effort. You've just begun your descent into the slowest royal collapse in English history. You stay seated at the corner of the chamber, the air thick with sweat, incense, and something unspoken that's been lingering for years, probably since 1536, the year of the fall. The jousting tournament had begun like any other court spectacle. Banners flying, crowds roaring, the king in armor gleaming like a golden beetle. And then, crash, horse, lance, body, and silence. You don't see it in the portraits, but that moment was the start of the royal rot. Henry was unconscious for 2 hours. 2 hours. Enough time to die and come back a slightly worse version of yourself. Historians still argue whether that injury permanently damaged his brain. Some suggest signs of traumatic brain injury in his later mood swings and memory loss. But they all agree on one thing: it ruined his legs. The wounds never fully healed. They reopened. They became ulcers. And not the discreet kind you mention in Whispers. These were horror show level wounds. You imagine a court physician peeling back a bandage only to see bone through shredded flesh. The smell? Like old meat left too close to the hearth. The texture? Something between spoiled custard and regret. They tried everything. Leeching, of course. Poultices of honey and rose oil. Applications of goose grease mixed with herbs. One concoction involved rabbit fat and powdered pearls, which sounds less like a remedy and more like something you'd find in a cursed cookbook. But nothing worked. The ulcers kept oozing, infection set in, and Henry? He became furious. The irony is unbearable. A king famous for charging into battle now couldn't even charge into his dining room without help. His legs throbbed day and night. You'd think being royal might insulate you from suffering, but no. It just meant your pain had a better wardrobe. Even his shoes had to be custom fitted, more like soft cages than footwear, to accommodate the swelling. Try ruling an empire when every step feels like you're dragging hot iron weights. And the throne, it wasn't just a seat of power, it was a literal seat. Henry spent most of his day in elaborate chairs fitted with extra padding, as if the cushions could absorb not just the pressure, but the political discomfort of a monarch who couldn't stand up without a team of attendants and a prayer. His legs weren't just a private misery, they were public knowledge. Courtiers whispered about them. Foreign ambassadors braced themselves for the smell. There are letters from visitors noting the pungent presence of the king. Some accounts say you could smell him from across the chamber. Others that servants had to clean the floor beneath his feet more than once a day. That's not just decay, that's history leaking into upholstery. And then there was the lancing, a daily ritual, knives, cloth, blood, pus. You imagine the surgeon entering the room each morning like a man walking toward a pit of lions, except the lions are made of ulcerated leg meat and the king is known for executing bad news. "Good morning, Your Majesty," he says, smiling too hard. "Shall we begin?" What follows isn't spoken of directly, but it's heard. The wet squish, the groans, the quiet cursing, the stained linens carried away like battlefield relics. It's astonishing what counts as routine in the palace. There were even specialized servants whose job was to care for the king's wounds. They're unnamed in history, but we should probably light a candle for them. And the worst part? The ulcers made everything else worse. Henry couldn't walk, which meant no exercise. No exercise meant weight gain. Weight gain meant more pressure on the legs. More pressure meant more pain. And more pain? That meant mood swings severe enough to end political careers and occasionally marriages. You know those movies where kings shout "off with his head" dramatically from a throne? In Henry's court, that actually happened. Usually after a painful attempt to stand up, or worse, after being contradicted while seated in damp bandages. The emotional cost was enormous. The man who had once ridden horseback into battle was now wheeled between rooms like oversized furniture. His frustration was volcanic. Sometimes he wept openly. Sometimes he screamed. Sometimes he did both, then demanded roast swan and a string quartet to distract himself. Tudor coping mechanisms were creative, but power protects itself. No one dared question him. No one said, "Perhaps, sire, we should reconsider the 6-pie breakfast." No one dared suggest he rest more or govern less. His declining health was an open secret, but no one could speak it aloud. To do so was treason. Literal, punishable by death treason. That meant the entire royal court had to pretend everything was fine, even while the king's legs were declaring war on his own body. Doctors, bless them, kept trying. One even suggested cauterization. Yes, burning the wounds shut. That one didn't last long. Henry screamed so loudly it reportedly startled the falcons in the hunting tower. He refused to let it happen again, which frankly seems like one of his more rational decisions. And yet despite the pain, he insisted on maintaining appearances. He still wore elaborate clothing, still sat for portraits, still summoned his council to discuss foreign policy, all while oozing into his chair like a fleshy lava lamp. That's commitment to the brand. But here's the twist. Beneath the ulcers, beneath the arrogance, beneath the fury, was a very scared man. A man slowly realizing that death wasn't just coming for him, it had already started nibbling on his calves. And for someone who had broken from Rome, dismantled monasteries, and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, that must have been terrifying. So tonight, you sit beside him. You smell the poultices and blood. You hear his labored breathing and muttered Latin prayers. You listen to the groan of chair legs beneath his weight. And you wait, like everyone else at court, for the next wheeze, the next mood swing, the next sign that the king's body is still losing, because what began as a cracked leg has now become a collapsing legacy. You're still in that dim, lavish room, and now you're watching attendants carry away bandages soaked in something between royal plasma and historical trauma. The curtains are drawn, not for privacy, but because the sunlight makes it harder to pretend nothing's wrong. Henry VIII, once the radiant embodiment of English virility, now exists mostly in shadow, propped up by silk cushions and unspoken truths. At this point, it's not just about pain, it's about presence. Henry has developed an aura, and not the kind you read about in spiritual texts. His most defining feature isn't his codpiece or his once glorious calves, it's the smell. A rich, putrid, inescapable stench that follows him like a disgraced herald. Even Tudor nose blindness couldn't ignore it. The leg ulcers that began with a bit of bruised pride and poor luck have become caverns of infection. Raw, open sores, crusted over with herbs that sound romantic in theory. Lavender, sage, myrrh, but in reality just smell like seasoned death. These wounds weren't shallow. Some witnesses claimed you could see down to the bone. Others claimed that the ooze from his legs soaked through his stockings, through the bandages, and onto the carpets. Imagine your job being foot rug replacer to the king. Visitors to court often brought small pouches of herbs or perfumed cloths to hold to their noses during audiences. One Spanish ambassador allegedly nearly fainted mid-conversation. Not from diplomacy fatigue, from Henry's ankles. You try to stay composed, breathe through your mouth, think about anything else. But it doesn't help. The air has weight. It's like being kissed by a rancid ghost. And the worst part? Everyone still had to pretend. You could be talking to the monarch of England, the most powerful man in the realm, while actively resisting your gag reflex. If your eyes watered, you claimed it was from emotion. If you staggered, it was from awe. If you vomited, well, you didn't, because then you'd be reassigned to the tower. Imagine the gallows humor among servants. "I'd rather clean the chamber pot than his boots," someone mutters. At least the pot doesn't fight back. His personal hygiene, already a delicate subject in Tudor England, went from questionable to actively hostile. Bathing wasn't common practice to begin with. Water was considered dangerous, especially for open wounds. Instead, they relied on powders, oils, and more clothing. Layers upon layers of fabric to trap the odor, which of course made everything worse. Underneath his brocaded garments was a stew of sweat, oils, decay, and something that smelled faintly like despair. His clothes were often so foul they had to be burned rather than cleaned. Servants who dressed him wore gloves. Some probably prayed before entering the royal wardrobe. And the clothing itself wasn't just for show. It was armor. Armor against acknowledgement. If you wrapped a man tightly enough in silk and symbolism, maybe no one would notice the rot. Maybe. But the rot wasn't just physical. It infected the mood of the court. Conversations became more guarded. Laughter dulled. The entire atmosphere of Whitehall began to bend around the king's discomfort like heat-warping glass. No one dared to speak plainly. Diplomats drafted letters in cautious language. His Majesty remains in a reflective state. Translation: he hasn't moved in 3 days and smells like a spoiled ham. And then, of course, there was the daily ritual, the lancing. Still, again, forever. You'd think it would get easier, but no. Each session was worse than the last. The ulcers resisted healing, deepening into chronic, pus-filled craters. The only solution, such as it was to slice them open and drain them, like rotting fruit with a crown. The screams echoed through the corridors, loud enough that new visitors thought someone was being tortured. Technically, they weren't wrong. Meanwhile, the physicians were burning out. These weren't modern medical professionals. They were men trained in astrology, prayer, and occasional guesswork. Every failed treatment added a layer of dread. Every sigh from the king felt like a test they were failing. One doctor wrote that he prayed more than he practiced. And still, they tried. Charcoal paste, vinegar compresses, wrapping the legs in gold leaf and goose feathers. One theory suggested placing crushed emeralds in the wounds would absorb the poison. Another advocated healing music, which was probably the least painful idea pitched that decade. Yet nothing stopped the stink. It haunted the palace. Guests would step into the chamber prepared to meet the king and find themselves nose first in royal decay. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was destabilizing. You can't inspire awe when your scent arrives 10 seconds before your voice. But Henry, he pressed on. Or rather was pressed on, into his throne, into his meals, into the role of supreme leader. He refused to stop governing, refused to let anyone treat him as an invalid. His signature still graced documents. His voice still echoed in council meetings. But everything else about him, especially below the waist, was deteriorating. He insisted on being painted as healthy, strong, and regal. The reality? He hadn't walked unaided in years. He hadn't mounted a horse since the ulcers deepened. He hadn't danced, hunted, or led troops in over a decade. But in the official portraits, you still see the stance, the hand on the hip, the face of a man who supposedly didn't smell like slow death. You wonder how those painters did it. Did they mentally block out the sight of the king being hoisted into position by attendants? Did they retouch him mentally the way Instagram filters smooth over wrinkles now? Probably. And for their efforts, they were paid handsomely and allowed to keep their heads. This is how it happens. Power decays in stages. First, the body, then the image, then finally the truth. But in Henry's case, the truth was simply postponed, sealed under layers of velvet and loyal silence. The king may have been dissolving into his own chair, but as long as no one said it out loud, he remained untouchable. Tonight, you're not just witnessing a physical collapse. You're watching a kingdom pretend it's not happening. The smell in the air, that's not just rot. That's fear, denial, and a very expensive blend of imported oils trying and failing to cover the scent of the end. You're seated at the edge of history's most cursed banquet table, a silver goblet in your hand, and a gnawing sense that someone here, probably the monarch, is eating himself to death in real time. If you thought Henry's ulcers were grotesque, wait until you see what's on the menu. Spoiler, it's not kale. Tudor England had a culinary philosophy best described as, if it once breathed, grill it, stuff it, or drown it in wine. And no one embraced this more zealously than Henry VIII. His daily meals were not so much sustenance as theatrical performance, a rotating buffet of bravado, cholesterol, and denial. Breakfast alone could send a lesser man into cardiac retirement. Eggs, mutton, white bread, ale, and sometimes roasted quail, because nothing says morning routine like a songbird cooked in despair. Fruits and vegetables? They existed, sure, as garnish, as decoration, occasionally as a tragic accident if they fell into the stew. You sit watching as attendants roll in platters the size of small rowboats. They're stacked with meats, venison, lamb, boar, eels, swan, peacock, goose, and everything is slathered in sauce. Henry believed deeply in gravy. If it could be drowned in brown or red liquid, it was. Think of it as a form of baptism into the royal stomach. But the meat was more than indulgence, it was ideology. In Henry's court, masculinity was measured in servings. To eat flesh was to rule. To gorge was divine. The king's appetite was political performance. Even if he could barely chew it, that's right. By this point in his reign, Henry's teeth were as decayed as his legs. Chewing had become an ordeal. So the food was softened. Pre-cut, sometimes mashed, occasionally pre-chewed by others, although historians politely avoid confirming that. Either way, dinner now resembled feeding time at a very privileged zoo. And yet, he insisted. The food had to come, had to be prepared in volume, had to be served with pageantry. A single meal might involve dozens of servants, trumpets, food tasters, entertainers, and a rotating cast of nobles praying they wouldn't be banished between bites. The king's personal consumption was staggering. Even accounting for the royal entourage, Henry's plate was always stacked higher than anyone else's. He once reportedly consumed a dish so rich in butter and cream, it caused 2 courtiers to faint just by smelling it. Okay, maybe that's an exaggeration, but not by much. And the drink? Oh, the drink. Wine flowed like national debt. Red, white, sweet, spiced, it didn't matter. Henry was practically 60% Cabernet by volume. Water was for peasants, horses, and hand-washing. Ale was fine for breakfast, but real monarchs uncorked at lunch and didn't stop until something blurred. Every day was a feast. Every night a slow-motion indigestion opera. Court physicians begged him to cut back. He listened, and then added another pheasant to his order. Their medical notes contained phrases like colic, bloated, and gassy distress, terms that sound genteel until you realize they describe a man groaning so loudly after dinner that people mistook it for divine punishment. And this gluttony wasn't just a personal tragedy, it had geopolitical consequences. An immobile king is a distracted king. A constipated monarch makes poor foreign policy decisions. You don't declare war because of politics. You declare it because someone put too much saffron in your pottage. Henry's own kitchen had to adapt. They began preparing easier foods, soft pies, puddings, jellied meats. They were creating culinary wheelchairs, meals he could manage despite his ruined teeth and overtaxed digestion. Some dishes were so rich and dense, they probably should have come with warnings. Or shovels. And here's where it gets weirdly meta. His meals weren't just massive, they were symbolic. If he was losing physical power, at least he could devour half the barnyard to prove he still had control over something. Meat as morale. Gravy as governance. A pork pie as political statement. One courtier described him as eating with great intention, which sounds noble until you realize it means he stared at his roast goose like it owed him rent. And yet, no one dared intervene. Suggesting a salad might get you exiled. Whispering the word lentils could be a death sentence. You imagine a brave young physician stepping forward with a dietary scroll. Your Majesty, might I recommend... But he's interrupted by a sharp glance and a dropped turkey leg that hits the floor like a threat. Message received? Diet is treason. And as his weight ballooned, so did the problems. More food meant more digestive strain. More strain meant more rest. More rest meant less movement. Less movement meant more weight. You see the spiral? He was locked in a self-fattening loop, and everyone around him had to pretend it was fine. Even his throne had to be adjusted. Larger cushions, reinforced wood. Some sources say they built him a new version entirely, part chair, part bench, part architectural mystery, just to accommodate his majesty. All this while, England braced itself for political instability. The Reformation was still rippling. Succession questions loomed. And the king? He was yelling at the kitchen staff because his goose wasn't buttered enough. There's something tragic in it. You watch him eat, and you know he's trying to fill something that food can't touch. A void, a fear, a sense that his body is failing him faster than his mind can admit. So he consumes, and consumes, until the only thing faster than his meals is his decline. Tonight, you're still at that table. The roast is steaming. The goblet is refilled. The king lifts a trembling hand and tears off another bite. He chews slowly, painfully, swallows with effort, groans, wipes his mouth, and you realize this isn't just a banquet. It's a slow, delicious descent into royal oblivion. The next morning, you wake to the sound of trumpets and retching. Somewhere down the hall, the king is having his digestion narrated by 2 increasingly nervous physicians. This is not unusual. In Henry VIII's later years, mornings often began with complaints about bloating, followed by more food. He was quite literally eating himself into history and possibly out of it. The royal body was now a high-maintenance ecosystem. And just like any volatile natural environment, it demanded constant attention. The ulcers didn't take days off. His bowels were unreliable. His skin, perpetually inflamed, seemed to protest every contact. The king had become a sovereign-shaped pressure cooker, and someone had misplaced the manual. And yet, the feasting continued. Breakfast was less a meal and more a wake-up ceremony involving protein, wine, and denial. By this point, digestion had become both a national security concern and a regular topic of conversation among courtiers. Is the king in good spirits? Was code for, has he passed anything yet today? His diet was heavy, figuratively, literally, metaphorically. Red meat, poultry, cream sauces, and gallons of claret. A recipe for disaster. Gout, the signature condition of overfed nobles, was now staging a permanent coup in Henry's joints. Walking was agony. Standing, ambitious. Even lying down had to be strategic. There were entire evenings spent adjusting pillows just so he could shift his weight without blacking out. And still, the wine poured. Wine was more than a drink. It was a solution. To pain, to politics, to mortality. At least Henry believed it was. He drank so much red wine that some contemporary observers noted the reddish hue of his skin wasn't just sunburn, it was saturation. His physicians didn't prescribe less wine. They simply recommended spacing it between meat courses. You're watching the monarch slouch in his chair, flushed and breathing heavily after breakfast. He waves away a servant, then calls him back for more bread. The court musician plays something delicate in the background, likely an attempt to counteract the rhythmic groaning that has become the king's digestive soundtrack. This is where things get cyclical. Pain leads to more food. Food leads to more pain. The king lashes out. Someone gets exiled. Then he's comforted with a pie. The court becomes a ballet of appeasement and indigestion. It's like a very tense cooking show, except the main judge will have you executed for under-seasoning. His doctors take notes in trembling Latin. Some recommend exercise. Perhaps a light walk. Henry refuses. Why walk when you can be carried? Or better yet, wheeled? A mechanical chair is constructed. Part throne, part prototype wheelchair. He's loaded into it with a system of pulleys, cranks, and gentle pleating. You'd think they were moving a priceless sculpture, except this one yells at you. The chair is used for official duties, audiences, councils, dining. Henry is now functionally immobile, and everyone is pretending it's a sign of grandeur rather than collapse. He's not inactive, they insist. He's contemplative. He's not avoiding stares, he's strategically reclining. Back in his chambers, the physicians discuss his swelling ankles and worsening mood. They suggest cutting back on the evening roast swan with custard glaze. A brave suggestion. One that earns a glare from the king, followed by a banishment so swift the physician forgets to collect his leeches. The ulcers on his legs are worsening. The dressings now need to be changed twice daily. The smell has intensified. The pus, sorry, but yes, is darker now, possibly indicating deeper infection. One attendant claims it smells like God is angry. That same attendant later requests a transfer to stable duty. Still, Henry clings to routine. He insists on banquets, state dinners. He hosts dignitaries who politely smile through the smell. You witness one such dinner. The French ambassador sits opposite the king, dabbing his nose with a perfumed handkerchief. The king jokes about France. The ambassador laughs, then gags discreetly into his goblet. The king's appetite somehow has not dulled. He still demands second helpings. He still drinks. But now he must lean to the side to eat. His swollen hands struggle with utensils. Servants cut his food for him. The image of royal supremacy is still there, but it's unraveling. Slowly. With crumbs. In private, he complains more frequently. The pain is constant. The ulcers unrelenting. He cannot sleep without laudanum. He cannot wake without wine. His body is a battlefield where the only clear victors are swelling and regret. And in the middle of all this, the court continues to pretend. There are plays, masks, tournaments, even a musical commission to celebrate Henry's enduring strength. Which, given the context, feels like a joke told with a straight face. Even his wardrobe is complicit. His clothes are now custom fitted with secret slits for bandage access. His breeches are looser. His codpiece, once a proud symbol of virility, is now largely ceremonial, a sort of dignity placeholder. And through it all, Henry still sees himself as king, conqueror, head of church and state. He may be rotting, but he is the rot with a crown. To challenge that is to challenge God's order. So the courtiers smile, the physicians cringe, and the palace maids quietly replace cushions with more absorbent materials. You listen as the king groans again, hand on belly, eyes narrowed. Another feast approaches. Another chair has to be reinforced. And you can't help but wonder, how much more can his body endure? How much longer can the court continue its synchronized denial? But there's no answer. Just the scraping of platters, the distant sound of a lute, and the unmistakable wet shuffle of a monarch trying to reposition his own decay. By now, you've grown used to the sound of wheezing and upholstery straining under pressure. The once vibrant palace feels like a mausoleum with banquet service. You're not in the court of a mighty monarch anymore. You're in the living room of a man who's slowly becoming one with his furniture. Henry VIII doesn't walk. He is moved, lifted, pulled, wheeled, shifted like a large, moody heirloom. And it's not just inconvenient, it's logistically epic. Attendants no longer think in terms of minutes or miles, but in inches and leverage. Royal engineers have to innovate just to get the king from one room to another without causing a diplomatic incident or a hernia. His royal quarters now resemble a military operations center. There are pulleys hanging from beams, reinforced walking frames, and special ramps built for rolling him across uneven thresholds. The throne has been quietly modified. It's no longer just a symbol of power. It's part recliner, part containment unit. And then there's the chair. Not the throne. The chair. The mechanical contraption designed just to transport Henry from chamber to hall and back again. Think of it as a Tudor Roomba if the Roomba weighed 350 pounds, bled occasionally, and barked orders at you about foreign diplomacy. Historians argue whether this was England's first wheelchair or just an elaborate portable embarrassment. Either way, it was necessary. The king couldn't even stand without 3 attendants, a bracing pole, and a winch system that probably doubled as scaffolding for palace renovations. Armor? Ha! Once designed for glorious tournaments, it's now custom-fitted just to support his own weight. One suit had such large armholes that a courtier could allegedly hide in the sleeve. Whether that's legend or not, you believe it. Because honestly, it sounds about right. Henry hadn't gone to war in years, but his tailor was still waging one against fabric. Horses, once his favorite pastime, were now enemies. To get him onto one required a hoist, a literal crane, to lift the king into the saddle. And even then, the poor beast likely reevaluated its life choices. Riding had become a ceremonial photo op, staged and timed down to the second. The reign of thunderous gallops had given way to cautious clambering. You stand in the stable yard one morning and witness the farce. A team of footmen groaning under the weight of the king's saddle, the horse trembling slightly, and the winch groaning louder than the monarch himself. Also, the world could see the supreme head of the Church of England pretending to enjoy a morning trot. For 90 seconds. Exercise? Hilarious. His doctors recommended movement. Just a few steps a day, they begged. Maybe a slow walk around the chamber? Henry responded with a death glare and an extra helping of buttered eel. His preferred cardio was yelling. The only thing he moved consistently was his temper. Even raising his arm to gesture became a physical act of will. "Bring me the Chancellor," he would declare, and then collapse back into his pillows, sweating. Sometimes he pointed, sometimes he couldn't. And don't be fooled, this wasn't just sad. It was dangerous. Inactivity worsened his circulation, his digestion, his ulcers, his mood, especially his mood. You've never seen anyone get exiled so quickly for sneezing during a particularly difficult pivot out of bed? Royal physicians were constantly calculating. How long could he sit before his legs went numb? Could he make it through a council meeting without collapsing from heat under all the layers? They took notes like generals before a siege. Court ceremonies had to be modified, shortened, relocated. Speeches had to be timed between bouts of pain. One ambassador fainted from the heat during an audience, not realizing the windows were sealed shut to prevent a draft from worsening the king's mood. You can't help but notice the shift. The way everyone moves more carefully around him. The way ministers speak in soft, practiced tones. You're not addressing a king, you're navigating an unstable ecosystem. A monarch-shaped volcano on a velvet pillow. Even foreign policy was influenced. Campaigns postponed due to the king's reflective period. Alliances reconsidered based on whether Henry could stay awake for the meeting. Decisions were sometimes delayed simply because he couldn't be rolled far enough down the corridor that day. The palaces began adapting silently and structurally. Elevators weren't a thing, so they built ramps. Staff rerouted meetings to ground floors. Henry didn't descend stairs anymore, he descended expectations. But no one said anything. That's the unspoken rule. The king is not ill. The king is merely contemplative, strategic, anchored by divine purpose, and several dozen pounds of infected flesh. His physicians didn't say declining. They said still in repose. His advisors didn't say crippled. They said firmly seated in leadership. If someone let slip the truth, if they dared whisper that the king was no longer mobile, they might find themselves not only unemployed, but historically erased. This was not a court that tolerated honesty. It was a court that worshipped the illusion of continuity. You witness one small rebellion. A court scribe accidentally refers to the transport of His Majesty to the Great Hall. He meant it literally, but Henry reads it as a slight. The man is removed. Quietly. The next day, the phrase, His Majesty arrives with gravity and poise, appears in all official reports. And the thing is, it works. Sort of. The illusion holds. Foreign courts still write letters of respect. English nobles still curtsy low. Peasants still believe their king rides high above them, glinting in the sun. They don't see the pulleys, the dressings, the chair. They see what they're told to see. So tonight you're watching history bend around a body. You see a man who once chased deer on horseback, now issuing edicts from what is essentially a fortified ottoman. His voice still booms, his commands still carry. But everything else, it creaks, it swells, it leaks. The king is no longer a figure of motion, he is a monument, an idol built of bone, sweat, wine, and illusion. And his court? A temple of ritualized pretending, where movement is myth and every cushion bears the weight of royal decay. It's late afternoon and the sun casts a warm, honey-colored glow through the stained glass windows of Whitehall. But the warmth doesn't reach the far end of the room, not where Henry VIII sits, draped in layers of velvet, his jaw clenched and his leg wrapped in linen that's already beginning to spot through. And you know instantly, it's one of those days. The ulcer is flaring again. The stink hits first. You're getting good at recognizing stages. There's the sharp, medicinal tang of failed remedies, then the slow, creeping rank of infection left too long in luxury. It's not just unpleasant, it's alarming. you realize the infection isn't just surviving, it's thriving like a mutinous colony under royal socks. The king shifts and winces. No one reacts. Not because they don't notice, oh, they do, but because reacting is dangerous. A flinch could be interpreted as disrespect. A sideways glance as treason. Best to breathe shallowly and hope your eyes don't water. Now, you may be wondering, didn't all of Tudor England smell? After all, this was a time when bathing was rare, sewage systems were theoretical, and deodorant was a handful of rosemary in your pocket. You're right, body odor was everywhere. But Henry's smell? It transcended. It was an achievement. A multi-layered tapestry of decay. Even in a world that barely understood germs, people knew something was wrong. And the source, always the legs. Those ulcers were no longer simple medical curiosities. They were spectacles. Wounds so grotesque, so determined to defy science, prayer, and human dignity, that they became famous in their own right. Imagine being a visitor to court and being warned, don't get too close to His Majesty's ankles. You laugh, then you smell it. You stop laughing. Doctors tried everything. Herbal compresses soaked in vinegar and wine, poultices of honey, rose oil, and mashed herbs so exotic they probably sent some poor servant across half of Europe to find them. They even tried applying heated metal to burn the infection out. Cauterization, the medieval equivalent of hitting a computer when it freezes. The result? Pain. Screaming. And a distinct lack of healing. They even tested bizarre theories. One involved powdered toadstools. Another involved blessed moss scraped from church walls. One desperate soul suggested using cloth dipped in holy water wrapped in saints' relics. That physician mysteriously resigned shortly after. It wasn't just the ulcers. Henry's hygiene was a myth in retreat. With movement nearly impossible, bathing became impractical, then optional, then mythical. Instead, his servants used scented oils and powders, brushing them into his skin with soft cloths. It was essentially mummification with better marketing. And still, the smell grew. Every time he moved, a plume of something sour and tragic followed him. Courtiers developed entire techniques for subtle avoidance, pivoting slightly, breathing through silk, pretending to cough at key moments. Some even carried clove-stuffed oranges or pomanders, which they held to their faces like desperate little gas masks. One ambassador, writing to his king, described his audience as fruitful in matters of state, but most unfortunate in fragrance. That's Renaissance diplomacy for, I almost passed out in the throne room. Then there was the bandage duty. You don't hear much about them, but these were real people. Servants whose job it was to clean, dress, and bind the king's legs every single day. Twice on a bad day. They aren't named in history books. No portraits, no statues. But these anonymous souls deserve a moment of reverent silence. Because what they saw, what they smelled, what they scraped off royal calves with trembling hands and linen cloths, well, let's just say they earned their keep. The ulcers weren't just deep. They were changing. Angry red rims turned black at the edges. The tissue necrotized. Fluid darkened. Some said you could see worms. Others claimed the sores had become so sensitive the king would scream at the mere suggestion of cleaning them. Which, honestly, feels like a fair reaction. And yet, he insisted on appearances. When receiving foreign guests, Henry still wore silks, jewels, and heavily padded doublets. His legs hidden behind brocade, his hands trembling under rings too tight. The room would be perfumed before he entered. Candles lit to mask the odor. The throne freshly reupholstered just in case. And it almost worked. Almost. Until the moment he shifted wrong, or a bandage loosened, or a drop of something made its way through the folds. Then, like a horror story at a masquerade ball, the illusion shattered. People would recoil just a little. Just enough. But they never said a word. Never. To comment was to condemn. To wrinkle your nose was to gamble with your life. The king could have you executed for looking disgusted, or for saying the word ulcer too loudly, or for breathing wrong, which meant everyone tiptoed around the truth, literally and metaphorically. You watch a scribe carefully pen a report about the king's vibrant presence at a recent council. The truth? He barely spoke. His lips were dry, his eyelids heavy. The bandages on his legs had leaked through the stockings. But no one would dare include that in the royal archive. And this deception wasn't just personal, it was political. A stinking monarch was a weak monarch. If Henry's enemies suspected how ill he truly was, it could invite chaos, rebellion, foreign plots. So the truth was not just hidden, it was outlawed. In fact, under Tudor law, predicting or implying the death of the king was treason. Saying His Majesty is dying was the legal equivalent of saying, I would like to be publicly disemboweled, please. So the court played along. They bowed. They smiled. They praised his wisdom, and they subtly opened windows when he wasn't looking. Tonight you sit beside the throne, incense burning thick in the air. You hear the king's breath, slow, labored. You see the servants swap out the cloth beneath his legs. No one speaks, no one reacts. The stink is overwhelming, but no one says a word, because the king is still alive. And as long as he is, everyone else will pretend the ulcers are just a rumor. The next time Henry VIII is wheeled into a room, something's different. It's not the crown or the robes or the absurdly gilded sleeves big enough to smuggle a diplomat. It's the smell. Or rather, the timing of the smell. You sense it before the king arrives, like a warning bell made of rot. This isn't about poor hygiene anymore. No amount of lavender oil or burning herbs can disguise what's happening. The monarch is decomposing, while alive. His body is slowly becoming an olfactory prophecy. And everyone, from nobles to low-born staff, is suddenly very interested in breathing through their mouths. The courtiers have adapted. Their noses twitch when he enters, but never their lips. They practice blank expressions in the mirror. Even the royal dogs hesitate now, sniffing the air with suspicion. One nearly barked during a meeting with the French envoy, but was discreetly removed before it could speak the truth out loud. The source is no longer just his legs. His entire body has joined the rebellion. You overhear a physician mutter something about systemic breakdown before another shushes him with the urgency of a man avoiding death by hearsay. You think back to his youth, when Henry was clean-shaven, broad-shouldered, and positively radiant in his armor. Now, the armor exists mostly for appearances, propped in the corner like a ghost of better days. Henry no longer fits into it, of course. They keep it polished anyway, hoping the shine might out-distract the smell. It doesn't. Today's audience is with several ambassadors. The topic? Naval positioning. The unspoken topic? How close they can sit without vomiting. You watch the room strategically arrange itself like a chessboard made of silk sleeves and sweaty foreheads. The King of England, head of the church, defender of the faith, is gripping the arms of his chair. His face is pale. His fingers tremble slightly. You see a servant approach with a cloth and a quick flick of the wrist. The cloth is scented. Henry takes it, dabs his mouth, and continues speaking as if nothing is wrong. But everyone knows. They can't say it, but they know. And what they know is this. His body is betraying him. Not quietly, not slowly. Loudly and with terrible theatrics. The infection is deeper than ever. Beneath the robes, beneath the flesh, it festers. Historians still debate whether it was necrotizing fasciitis, sepsis, gangrene, or a cocktail of them all. What's not debated? The smell. It's in the letters, the diaries, the trembling recollections of visitors who left court with horror, etched between their lines of diplomatic small talk. And Henry is aware, he's not stupid. His vanity may be stubborn, but it isn't blind. He knows people are suffering in silence around him. He sees the perfumed kerchiefs. He notices when people subtly edge closer to windows or request meetings outdoors under flimsy excuses about fresh air and admiring the architecture. But to acknowledge it, to speak of it, that would mean surrendering the last illusion that he is still the monarch of his golden years. That beneath the robes and titles and layers of powder lies something more than a bloated, infected shell. So he rages. One morning, he hurls a pewter goblet across the room after a physician dares suggest a new poultice. Another time, he has a servant dismissed mid-dressing because the man winced while wrapping a weeping sore. The court is learning. Fear keeps people silent longer than loyalty, but fear doesn't stop the body. And Henry's body is now the loudest voice in the room. You witness the royal laundry being burned in the courtyard. Not washed, burned. The garments are soiled beyond recovery. His inner shirts must be changed multiple times a day. The staff responsible for washing his linens are rotated regularly, lest they faint or, worse, start telling stories. No one discusses this openly, but there's a schedule, an informal list of who's on bandage duty or clothing collection. It's a grim lottery, and everyone prays not to win. Those who do emerge pale and silent, their mouths pressed into hard, thin lines. There's even talk that some of his outer garments are stuffed with absorbent padding. Layers of fabric and herbs packed like insulation in a royal attic. You wonder how many stitches are sewn just to prevent a diplomatic disaster mid-supper. One painter tasked with creating a new portrait faints halfway through the sitting. Officially, he suffered a touch of heat. Unofficially, the odor hit him like a cannonball, and he had the misfortune of standing downwind. The painting is finished by an apprentice. From memory, while gagging. Even his own bed has betrayed him. The mattress is changed weekly, not for comfort, for sanitation. The servants who handle the linens wear gloves soaked in vinegar and wine, hoping the fumes will mask the stench and kill whatever's trying to crawl out from under the sheets. And still, Henry performs. He holds audiences, he orders executions, he debates theology, even as he leaks onto his own throne cushion. This isn't just denial, it's royal theater. And the entire court is complicit, because no one dares say what everyone knows. The king is dying from the outside in. You see it in their eyes, the nobles and clerks and chambermaids. They tiptoe around it like it's a ghost. They whisper euphemisms. His Majesty is in delicate health. The king is contemplative today. The swelling continues, but spirits are high. Spirits are not high. They are doused in wine and powdered rose petals floating above a sea of spoiled meat and regret. The truth is, Henry is afraid. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of being pitied. Afraid of death, especially a slow, smelly one that won't even let him go out in dignity. So he does what he's always done. Doubles down. If people flinch, he stares harder. If the court murmurs, he speaks louder. If the rot spreads, he layers more fabric over it and declares himself strong. But strength, like incense, can only hide so much. Tonight the palace halls are quieter. The servants walk softly. The windows are open despite the January cold. Anything to let the scent of rot escape. Anything to let people pretend the most powerful man in England is not dissolving by inches in his own chair. You walk past his chamber door and pause. The air is heavy, foul, ancient, and yet still. Because for all his decay, for all the royal gangrene now writing his obituary in smell, Henry VIII is still king. And no one, not even his own body, has dared remove the crown. Yet. It's another morning in the Tudor court, which means the sky is gray. The air smells like ointments and overcooked mutton, and somewhere behind the oak-paneled walls, the King of England is already yelling at someone. You know the drill by now. Henry's voice isn't just loud, it's unstable. Every day is emotional roulette. Is he furious? Sentimental? vaguely poetic with a dangerous edge. You wait with your breath held and your eyebrows raised like the rest of the court, trying to gauge the mood from the first bellow. He's in a rage today. Someone forgot to salt his eggs. Someone looked at him for too long. Someone didn't look at him long enough. It doesn't matter. The man who once rode into battle with banners and fanfare now battles his surroundings from bed, and the casualties are often bureaucratic. The mood swings, once rare and excusable, are now legendary. He goes from chuckling about a poem to accusing the poet of heresy. From weeping over Jane Seymour's memory to banishing a trusted advisor within the same 10-minute span. The court lives in fear not of what he'll say, but how fast he'll change course while saying it. Historians still argue whether this volatility came from untreated depression, chronic pain, or some lingering brain injury from that infamous jousting accident in 1536. Maybe all three. Maybe just a lifetime of entitlement, meeting the slow realization that no feast, no robe, no royal decree can reverse decay. But regardless of the origin, the result is unmistakable. Psychological whiplash at court. Advisors walk on verbal eggshells. One wrong word and you're demoted, imprisoned, or worse, assigned to foot duty. And here's the thing, this isn't new. Henry's been executing close allies since his 20s. But now it feels indiscriminate, like emotional weather patterns. Stormy in the morning, sunny by supper, occasionally hurricane with a chance of beheading. You sit in on a council meeting. It starts well enough. Henry, propped up in a modified chair-throne hybrid, mumbles approval at trade negotiations. Then someone mentions the word succession. His eyes narrow. You feel the shift. The air gets heavy. He slams his cup down, declares the entire council slippery as French eels, and calls for his fool. Meeting adjourned. And what of the fool? Poor Will Somers, the last court jester England would ever officially know. Once a bright spot in the King's Day, even he treads lightly now. His jests are rehearsed, his laughs forced. No one wants to be the last joke Henry ever hears. The physicians whisper among themselves. They suspect something deeper. Not just bodily rot, but mental fray. One doctor notes that Henry seems to hallucinate, talking to people who aren't there, hearing whispers no one else hears. But the other doctor shushes him. Again. Even among healers, self-preservation comes first. You follow a chamberlain down a side corridor. He's just come from the king's private rooms and is muttering to himself. Cried again, he says. Wept over Jane. Again. And you realize something chilling. Henry, for all his fury, is also haunted. Jane Seymour, his third wife and the only one to give him a legitimate male heir, has become something like a ghost that drifts through his pain. He keeps her portrait nearby, talks to it, cries, then demands it be taken away, then asks for it back. It's grief weaponized by powerlessness, but grief is only one color in this emotional spectrum. The others are redder, hotter. When Henry gets angry now, he doesn't just shout, he destroys. Political opponents, banished, servants, whipped, friends, executed. Remember Thomas More? Sir Thomas More, the king's former chancellor, confidant, and drinking companion? Gone. Executed for not affirming the king's supremacy over the church. No trial worth mentioning. Just an axe and a warning to the rest of the world. Agree with me or disappear. And yet, Henry still insists he's doing God's work. Which brings us to the divine irony. He's the head of the Church of England, and yet his moods are anything but holy. Prayer has become performance. Piety, a habit. He attends services, yes, but mostly so no one can accuse him of drifting from the light while drowning in bodily darkness, and everyone plays along. Bishops nod earnestly. Priests bless his meals. No one says, Maybe divine favor wouldn't require 6 cushions and a full decanter of opiates just to get through breakfast. You start noticing the servants have their own coded system for reading the king's moods. They call it the brow. If the king's left eyebrow arches, it means he's annoyed. If both arch, he's plotting. If neither move, run, he's either in pain or pre-apocalyptic silence. Even children in the palace know. One page, no older than 10, warns another not to enter the chamber if the king is whispering Latin. Apparently that's when he's either praying or preparing to accuse someone of heresy. Hard to tell. Better safe than executed. And amidst all this turbulence, there's one grim constant. Pain. Physical, of course, from the ulcers and the gout and the bloating. But also emotional. The pain of being trapped inside a body that can no longer project power except through tantrums. It's hard to be majestic when your own legs reject your authority. So Henry overcompensates, with volume, with punishments, with a performance of control so loud it drowns out his own deterioration. Tonight, the palace is tense. The king screamed earlier, no one knows why. Dinner was sent back, the musicians dismissed. Someone says he cried afterward. Someone else says he was singing. No one knows for sure. No one dares ask. You walk through the corridors and the silence is deafening. Not peace, not rest. Just the silence of people waiting to see which king will wake up tomorrow. The charming young prince who once wrote poetry? Long gone. The sharp-eyed diplomat who restructured the English church? Faded. All that remains now is the moody, festering tyrant in a chair, and still, somehow, England bows. The days drag on in a swirl of perfumed cloths, hushed courtiers, and the unshakable denial that hangs heavier than the scent of infection. You're starting to notice it now, not just the rot, not just the instability, but the way the palace itself is contorting around Henry's decline. The walls don't echo anymore. Conversations end sooner. Hallways feel longer. This is a kingdom ruled not by authority, but by euphemism. You hear them everywhere. His Majesty is in contemplation. The king is enjoying a season of rest. His Majesty has chosen to remain private today. These phrases flutter through court like silk veils over gaping wounds. Because the truth that Henry VIII is dying is illegal. Yes, literally illegal. Under Tudor law, to speak openly about the king's impending death was an act of treason. Predict it? You hang. Even hint at it too cleverly in poetry? Your neck meets the blade. This wasn't just superstition, it was strategy. As long as no one could say he was dying, he remained king. And as long as he remained king, the kingdom didn't have to face what came next. A sickly boy, a regency council, and half a continent waiting to pounce. So instead, the palace invented a whole new language. He is reflective today meant he's hallucinating again, and hasn't opened his eyes since dawn. The king is recovering his strength meant he hasn't stood in a week and passed out after a single bite of beef. His Majesty is considering matters of succession, meant he was unconscious while 3 men argued over who gets to run things when he finally drops. You're reading a letter now, written by a diplomat to his sovereign. It says the king's mind remains sharp, though his body shows signs of humors in flux. Which is 16th century for, this man is absolutely melting. But the real tragedy? The lie isn't just for the world, it's also for Henry. The king himself refuses to acknowledge what everyone else whispers behind handkerchiefs. He issues commands, he signs edicts. He even orders changes to his will, editing the names of men he no longer trusts. Which is almost all of them. He still micromanages everything, except his own body, which is slipping through his fingers like gravy off a feast platter. You're there when the Regency Council is amended. It's supposed to govern after his death, guiding his young son Edward. But the process is chaotic. Names are added, crossed out, added again. Henry doesn't trust anyone, but he knows someone has to hold the crown while Edward is still too small to lift it. He's trying to rule from a bed that smells like vinegar and regret. You realize he's avoiding one word. Dying. He won't say it. No priest is summoned, no confessor, no final speech to the nation. Just more paperwork, more orders, more clinging to a throne that no longer fits. Even his will, the document that should represent clarity at the end of chaos, is a paranoid patchwork of edits. He dictates new lines between coughing fits. One moment he trusts the Duke of Norfolk, the next he removes him entirely. Advisors pretend to agree, then scurry to their own factions, whispering, calculating. Because everyone knows what Henry refuses to admit. The moment he dies, the knives come out. Not literal ones yet, but political blades, sharpened and sheathed, just waiting for the crown to wobble. Meanwhile, the physicians do their part in the royal delusion. God willing, he shall recover, one says, loudly enough for the guards to hear. He doesn't mean it, no one does. But that phrase, God willing, is the best defense against treason. It's vague, safe, approved. One doctor, bolder than most, dares suggest that last rites be prepared. He disappears from court 2 days later. His replacement arrives with a bag full of rosewater and a very firm grasp of metaphor. Behind closed doors, the servants are talking. Quietly, carefully. They've begun hoarding black garments, mourning clothes. Not because they're certain he's dead, but because they will be soon, and making a public display of shock when it happens is easier when your outfit is pre-washed. In the kitchens, menus are shortened, less meat, fewer courses. Not to ease the king's digestion, he's hardly eating now, but to reduce the chance of serving something inappropriate during his extended period of rest. Heaven forbid the court celebrates with roast duck the night he finally expires. Even the rats seem to know. You hear stories of them scurrying away from his chambers. Superstition, probably. Or maybe even they can smell what's coming. You watch a clerk draft a letter. It begins, His Majesty rests deeply this week, reflecting on matters of eternity. He pauses, crosses out eternity, writes dynasty. It's safer. One noblewoman remarks, sotto voce, the king is surely immortal in spirit. She doesn't believe it. No one does. But the lie's so old now, so well rehearsed, it no longer feels like deceit. It feels like protocol. And in the middle of all this, Henry lies in bed, half dozing, half listening, half rotting. His mind flickers in and out like a candle guttering against a draft. Occasionally he rouses, barks an order, and then slumps back down. You can tell he still thinks he's feared. He still thinks he is England. But you also see his fingers twitching, like he's reaching for something just out of reach. A sword? A signature? Salvation? He refuses priests. When one finally sneaks in under the guise of a visitor, Henry glares. I'm not dead yet, he mutters. And the priest wisely just nods. Outside the chamber, preparations continue. Quietly. A casket is commissioned, a carriage reinforced, a plan drafted for when the moment comes, because it will come. And when it does, they'll all pretend they didn't know. Tonight, the palace is lit with fewer candles, not from economy, but to dim the evidence, to make the truth a little harder to see. You sit in the shadows and listen to Henry's breath. Shallow, uneven. Each exhale more uncertain than the last, and still no one speaks the word. Because to say it out loud would break the spell. And no one at court, not even the dying king, wants to be the one to end the play before the final act. Another sunrise, another day spent pretending that England isn't currently being ruled from a mound of cushions and suppurating wounds. You're in the king's chamber now, more hospice than throne room, watching Henry VIII scribble notes with a trembling hand. His once powerful signature is barely a wobbly squiggle. But he's still giving orders, still trying to rule an empire, one ink blot at a time. The scribes don't meet his eyes anymore. They hover, hands poised, ready to transcribe decrees that make less and less sense. One minute he's instructing changes to naval defenses, the next he's ordering a tapestry removed because he swears the saints are staring at him. No one questions it. They just nod, scribble something meaningless, and back away like he's a beached lion still capable of one last swipe. He doesn't rise from bed. He can't. His legs are swollen grotesquely, the ulcers wrapped in increasingly frantic layers of cloth. You've stopped counting how many times the bedding has been changed. There's a quiet war waging between the physicians and the infection is winning on points. His appetite has dwindled, though by Tudor standards he still eats like a man on death row, requesting his last supper 3 meals a day. Everything is pre-cut, softened, served with a spoon and a compliment. Even chewing is an ordeal now, his jaw tender and his gums raw. One bite too many, and he has to rest for half an hour. And yet, the paperwork continues. He revises his will again, 3rd time this week. The names on the Regency Council change with each revision. He doesn't trust anyone. One day, the Earl of Hertford is his most trusted advisor. The next, Henry claims he smells of treason. You wonder if that's a political insight or just a dig at his cologne. What's remarkable is how deeply this theater of control persists. Despite the bed sores, the ulcers, the constant fever, Henry insists on seeing foreign correspondences. He dictates letters to ambassadors. He discusses coinage of all things. There's something tragically comic about watching a man too sick to stand argue about the size of next year's silver penny. But it's not funny. Not really, it's desperate. And it's personal. Because in his mind, this isn't about currency or politics. It's about presence. Henry thinks that if he keeps signing documents, he won't fade. That if he issues enough commands, his body will obey again. That if he controls the machinery of monarchy, then the machinery of death will wait its turn. So he signs. And signs. Until his hand cramps and a servant has to gently coax the quill from his fingers. Meanwhile, his courtiers speak in euphemisms so thick it could be used as insulation. His Majesty is focused today. Translation. He shouted at a chair for 15 minutes and then fell asleep, mid-sentence. His Majesty remains attentive to matters of state, which means he hallucinated a debate with Cardinal Wolsey, who died 10 years ago. Still, the business of kingship goes on. At one point, he calls for his son, Edward. The boy is 9, delicate, wide-eyed. He enters the chamber cautiously, like a child approaching an unpredictable dog. You watch as Henry reaches for his hand, an awkward, swollen grasp, and tells him to be brave. To trust God. To rely on the Regency Council, though probably not all of them. It's a strange moment. Not tender exactly, but real. Then, almost immediately, Henry waves him away and demands someone bring a turkey leg. He doesn't eat it, just holds it for a while, like a meaty scepter. And so the documents pile up. He edits treaties, approves military appointments. At one point, he insists on writing a final note to Anne of Cleves, his ex-wife turned semi-roommate. No one stops him. Frankly, they're impressed he remembered she was still around. Even as the fever worsens, he refuses confession. Priests come and go, offering quiet prayers from a distance, hoping he'll summon them closer. He doesn't, or he can't. Or he's pretending not to hear. When asked if he wishes to be shriven, to make peace with God, he mutters something about having already been God's vessel. A bold claim for a man actively disassembling from the waist down. You see flashes of lucidity, the occasional sharp comment, the sudden clarity when he recalls a battle date or a court scandal. But they fade fast, like candles in a draft. Moments later, he's rambling about his second wife's laugh and whether or not someone moved the stars last night. Outside the chamber, the palace tightens. Guards are doubled. Documents are reviewed for anything vaguely traitorous. One servant is dismissed for writing a letter that included the words, "after the king." Didn't matter what came next. That phrase alone was enough. Timing is everything, especially when death has become the guest no one dares introduce. And yet, the kingdom knows. News travels in silence, through glances, through servants' hands brushing past each other, through the way people start using the past, tense a moment too early, and then correct themselves with a cough. Tonight, the king's chamber is quieter than usual. Fewer scribes, fewer papers. Just a single candle flickering on the side table and the rhythmic wheeze of a man who once terrified Europe now struggling to inhale. He's still holding a quill, still issuing orders, still pretending the world needs one more decree before it can spin again. And maybe he believes that. Because if the pen keeps moving, then the heart must still be beating. And as long as the hand signs, the king remains, even if no one's reading anymore. It's well past midnight. You're still in the king's chamber, though the candle has burned halfway down, and the room smells more like an apothecary than a palace. Henry VIII lies there, motionless but not entirely still. His eyes flicker open every so often, unfocused, searching for a memory or perhaps just the edge of the ceiling that isn't spinning. His mouth moves occasionally, mouthing words too soft to catch. You lean closer and realize he's muttering names. Some you recognize. Wives, courtiers, perhaps saints. Others are unknown, long-lost fragments of a mind that refuses to shut down even as the body declares mutiny. And then it happens. A final visitor arrives, not a doctor or a scribe, but Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. He approaches with the hesitant reverence of a man walking into a lion's den, though by now the lion is more shadow than substance. Cranmer isn't there to argue policy or theology. He's come to ask the unaskable, whether Henry still trusts in Christ. It's the question everyone's been circling for weeks. Not because they need spiritual clarity, but because it matters legally. The king's salvation, legacy, and posthumous image all depend on it. England needs a confession, a final affirmation, something to print on the prayer books. But Henry doesn't speak. He's drifting, suspended in a place between power and powerlessness. The man who once thundered through palaces now barely breathes. His lips are cracked. His face is pale except for a slight purplish tint around the cheeks. The color of blood that's given up. Cranmer leans in again, gently clasps the king's hand, and repeats the question. And this time, there's a twitch. A slow squeeze. Just the barest pressure, one hand to another. That's it. No words. No dramatic dying breath. Just a twitch. Was it an answer? Was it an accident? Historians still argue over that moment. Some believe it was a true profession of faith. Others suspect it was just muscle memory or a spasm from a dying hand reaching for anything solid. But that squeeze? That's what passes for a royal confession. Not a speech, not a final psalm, just skin on skin in the quietest chamber in the kingdom. You'd think a man like Henry VIII would go out with a roar. Something memorable, cinematic. A declaration, perhaps? One final insult to Rome, or a tearful apology to Anne Boleyn's ghost. But no. All the drama he loved in life seems to have escaped him in death. Because this is not a death of fireworks. This is a death of paperwork. The will is signed. The Regency Council is named. The body has begun shutting down in layers. You see it in his fingers, no longer moving. In his chest, no longer heaving. In his face, slack now, as if he's finally let go of the performance. There are no whispered regrets. No long monologue about the toll of power. Just the smell of ointments, the rustle of a final document, and the awkward silence of those who have absolutely no idea whether to cry yet or not. A priest begins reading scripture quietly, as much for himself as for the king. No one stops him this time. And while all this unfolds, the people closest to Henry are pretending not to panic. Because here's the legal catch. No one can say he's dead. Seriously, it's not just taboo, it's treason to declare the king dead without official permission. So when the room falls still and the final breath rattles out like a question left unanswered, no one reacts, not immediately. Everyone just waits. A physician glances at another. The servants freeze. One scribe begins to fold his papers, then quickly stops. The courtiers shuffle their feet like schoolboys waiting for the teacher to return and confirm that yes, class is dismissed forever. Because until someone authorized says he's gone, the king is still alive in law, and law in Tudor England is terrifyingly literal. Eventually they agree. Say nothing. Not today, not yet. Let the court convene. Let the proper scrolls be read. Let the power pass like a relay baton rather than a body bag. Meanwhile, Henry lies in the bed, eyes closed, hand limp. The man who once broke with the Pope now gets a death as bureaucratic as his theology. There's a strange kind of poetry in it. A king who redefined religion dies in a room where religion is too scared to enter. A man who reshaped the monarchy dies surrounded by people pretending nothing has changed. A man who made entire wives vanish with pen strokes now disappears himself with barely a whisper. The room doesn't erupt in grief. There are no tears, no cries of, "Long live the king." Just the soft hush of people slowly realizing what must come next, and how careful they must be about every word they speak. You stay in that chamber a little longer listening to the quiet. It isn't peaceful, it's too tense for that. It's the silence of gears shifting, the machine of monarchy adjusting itself to move forward without its engine. Outside, the sky is gray. The bells don't ring. Not yet. But the wind seems to change. Because whether or not anyone will admit it, Henry VIII is gone, and the kingdom has already begun to hold its breath. The king is dead, but no one says it. The chamber remains in a state of motionless pretense, as if Henry VIII has simply decided to take a very intense nap. The servants move carefully, speaking in coded phrases. His Majesty rests. His Majesty requires silence. His Majesty is reflecting. The man hasn't breathed in hours, but legally he's very much alive. You glance around and see it. The nerves, the glances, the slow shuffling of feet away from the bed. Everyone knows, but no one will be the first to admit it. Not because they fear the truth, but because the law says to do so is to commit treason. Welcome to Tudor England, where the dead king still rules the room. Physicians do what they can to prolong the illusion. They adjust his pillows. They reposition his hand. One doctor even checks his pulse, then nods ambiguously and mutters, "His humors are in divine flux." That phrase doesn't mean anything, but it buys them time. Time to prepare. Time to coordinate. Time to make sure that when they do announce his death, it won't feel like panic. It'll feel like protocol. And so, in the absurdity of royal politics, the most powerful man in the country must remain unofficially alive for several more days, as courtiers scurry like actors backstage, adjusting props and swapping scripts before the curtain falls for good. You follow a group of scribes down the hall. They're already updating documents, removing references to Henry and adding in new language for his son Edward, though they don't yet use the word king. Instead, it's the boy, the heir, the future. Like the throne is still in escrow. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the palace, Edward is being told that his father is very unwell. Not dead, not even dying, just deep in rest. Because even the child king must be protected from the knowledge that the crown is already creeping toward his head like a cold, jeweled serpent. And it's not just the family being kept in the dark. Foreign diplomats are still being received by officials who bow deeply, speak solemnly, and pretend they haven't noticed the royal apartment smell faintly of clove, lavender, and slowly failing embalming attempts. One French ambassador, suspicious but polite, asks about the king's health. The response? His Majesty is unavailable as he reflects upon matters of succession. Which, if you're wondering, is a euphemism so thick it could be used as royal carpet padding. Behind closed doors, the machinery of monarchy begins to crank. The Privy Council convenes. Not openly, not yet, but intense whispered meetings full of nervous glances and contingency plans. Because they know what comes next, and what comes next is chaos if they're not careful. Henry didn't leave behind a seasoned heir. He left behind a 9-year-old boy with a fragile constitution and a face barely able to grow a frown, let alone a beard. Edward is clever, yes, but he's a child, and children don't rule kingdoms. Men do. Or, in this case, men who think they should. And so the council assembles like vultures in robes. They're not grieving, they're positioning. Each man wants to be the one closest to the new boy king. Not out of love, but for control. Because whoever controls Edward controls England. And in Tudor politics, loyalty is often just an opening bid. You watch as the seals are prepared. Royal documents are subtly altered. Mourning clothes are brought out, not to be worn yet, but just to make sure they're ready. You see tailors weeping over black velvet they know they'll be cutting by morning. And still, no official announcement. Not until the stage is set. In the dead of night, messengers are dispatched to key nobles and foreign embassies. Their instructions? Don't say anything until we say everything. The message is clear. This death is not to be reacted to, it's to be managed. The absurdity continues. The king's body, now in full decomposition mode, is discreetly moved to another chamber. It's called the Room of Repose, which sounds elegant until you remember it's really just a glorified storage area for corpses in denial. His legs have swollen again. The stench is worsening. The physicians apply more spices, more linen, more whispered prayers. It's not about preservation anymore, it's about postponement. Every hour counts. At Sion Abbey, where the king's coffin will temporarily rest, a handful of monks have been given quiet instructions. Prepare the space, but don't ask why. Back at Whitehall, a strange kind of pageantry unfolds. Court musicians play softly. Nothing too jubilant, nothing too mournful. Just enough to create the illusion that things are normal, that the air doesn't carry the distinct aroma of cedar, sweat, and state-sponsored decomposition. You pass by a tapestry being taken down. It's being cleaned, someone says. Translation: it's being replaced with one that features Edward. Finally, on the 4th day, after the council is unified, the heir has been briefed. The court is dressed in symbolic black, and every single servant has been sworn to secrecy under penalty of something horrible. They announce it. The king is dead. Not just dead, gloriously departed. The announcement is made with great solemnity. Bells toll. Trumpets blare. Everyone in the palace acts surprised, like they hadn't been holding their breath for 4 days, waiting for someone else to admit the obvious. You'd think the world would weep. But instead, everyone exhales, because now the game can resume. Tonight, Henry VIII's body lies still in its makeshift coffin, surrounded by candles and silence. Outside, the air is crisp. Black banners are unfurled. Servants cry politely. Nobles bow to Edward, still blinking in confusion. And the kingdom begins its slow, careful transition from one era to another. But for now, the silence of 4 days finally breaks. The king is dead. Long live the king. The moment Henry VIII's death is finally announced, the machinery of monarchy lurches into motion like a cart rolling downhill with a suspicious rattle. The Privy Council convenes publicly for the first time in days. The court dons its blackest silks, and somewhere in the kitchen someone quietly cancels the afternoon pudding. Mourning is now mandatory and performative. But beneath the black velvet and choked-up prayers lies a far more pressing concern: what to do with the body. Because Henry, in death as in life, refuses to behave conveniently. His size alone presents a logistical nightmare. Over 300 pounds of ulcerated royal flesh now needs to be preserved, moved, and displayed with dignity, all while leaking. He's too heavy for standard methods, too decomposed for extended delays, too... Henry, for any of this to go smoothly. You're in the privy chambers when the embalmers arrive. They look grim, experienced, the kind of men who have seen things but not this thing. Their expressions say what everyone else is too afraid to. We should have started days ago. In the frigid halls of Whitehall, they begin the process. First, they wrap the body, linen soaked in aromatic oils, spices, and crushed herbs, clove, cinnamon, myrrh, lavender, enough to start a medieval tea company. Then they stuff the cavities with absorbent materials, a technique not unlike prepping a turkey for winter storage. The goal is simple: contain the king long enough to display him without having him melt through the upholstery. It does not go well. Despite their best efforts, the corpse begins to leak. Slowly at first, then alarmingly. Dark, viscous fluid seeps through the wrappings, staining the coffin and causing the air to sour with a smell that even the strongest potpourri can't cover. But they push forward, because they have to. The procession must happen. The nation must see the pageantry. They can't cancel the royal funeral because the guest of honor has started to ferment. So they do what royal handlers have always done. They improvise. The coffin is reinforced, sealed hastily with pitch and wood. Cloths are stuffed into crevices, carpets laid beneath it, just in case. The illusion must be maintained. Then comes the journey to Windsor. It's winter, cold, damp, but not cold enough. As the coffin travels, escorted by black-clad nobles and grim-faced guards, it begins to groan. Not metaphorically, literally. The gases inside, building from internal decomposition, make the wood creak and pop. It's like the king is protesting the motion one last time. They stop at Sion Abbey for a rest. Big mistake. Here, the coffin swells further. One crack becomes visible along the lower seam. And then, it leaks. A dark stain pools beneath it. The attendants go pale. One of the guards dry heaves behind a pillar. It's the moment everyone feared. But it gets worse. A dog, stray, or perhaps a wayward court pet, trots over, sniffs the base of the coffin, and begins to lick it. Yes, that happened. You stand frozen as nobles recoil, priests cross themselves, and someone desperately shoos the animal away, all without drawing attention to the scene unfolding like a grim Shakespearean farce. One chronicler later claims it was a divine punishment. Others insist it was symbolic. But everyone agrees on one thing. This funeral procession has now entered the realm of historic embarrassment. Still, the show must go on. They clean the floor, rewrap the coffin, burn incense by the cartload, and continue toward Windsor Castle, pretending that the king's final journey doesn't resemble an overripe cheese being wheeled through a perfume factory. The people along the route cheer. They wave banners. They cry into handkerchiefs. Because this is what you do. You grieve. You revere. You pretend the man in the box didn't once execute 2 wives, decapitate friends, rewrite the country's religion, and then burst like a royal meat sack halfway through his own funeral. You finally arrive at St. George's Chapel. The coffin is lowered carefully, slowly, with attendants white-knuckling every inch. The spot has already been prepared. A quiet, vaulted corner next to Jane Seymour, the wife who died young, gave him a male heir and, crucially, didn't live long enough to disappoint him. There is no grand mausoleum, no marble monument towering over pilgrims. Just a vault in the floor. You almost feel bad. Almost. Because this was a man who spent decades planning his own tomb. It was supposed to be magnificent. a monument to royal supremacy, gold, statues, candles that burned forever. At one point, he even commissioned an automated angel choir. Yes, really. He imagined eternity as a concert in his honor. Spoiler, it never happened. His tomb was never finished, his effigy never carved. The project languished, was delayed, then quietly abandoned. In the end, the man who created his own church, shattered centuries of tradition, and ruled England through sheer obstinate volume, was buried like a moderately important civil servant. No inscription marked his resting place for more than a century. People walked over it without realizing. Tourists stood above his bones while wondering where the real kings were buried. You couldn't script a more ironic ending if you tried. So here you are, watching as the coffin, still wrapped in the smells and shame of its journey, is lowered into the vault. There are prayers, a few tears, but mostly there's a quiet sense of relief. Relief that the performance is over, that the stench is finally sealed, that the long, exhausting era of Henry VIII has reached its final, undignified stop. You look around. The mourners are already starting to leave. The attendants begin cleaning the wax from the floor. Somewhere nearby, the future, Edward VI, is being fitted for his coronation robes. And beneath the stone floor, a king who died not with grandeur, but with gurgles. Not with reverence, but with rot. And you can't help but think, for a man who demanded everything, Henry VIII's last request, to be remembered as glorious, might just be the one thing history refused to honor. Now the bells ring. Late, yes, but they ring. Across London and into the countryside, towers toll the death of a man who, until recently, wasn't dead. Officially. Monks chant dirges. Priests speak of legacy. People gather in churches, some to mourn, others to make sure he's actually gone. And with that, the great noise of Henry VIII finally ends. Or does it? Because here's the twist no one at court saw coming. The moment Henry's body is sealed beneath the stone floor at Windsor, his legend begins to swell. Not in flesh, God no, but in myth. The man who broke with Rome, who married 6 times, who created his own church by scribbling "nope" in the margins of the Pope's letters, who danced in armor, wrote sonnets, and executed wives between lunch courses. That man becomes something else now, narrative. You see it immediately. Portraits are commissioned, but not of the bloated, broken man who died. No, they paint the young Henry. Broad-chested, sharp-eyed, legs like marble columns and a codpiece that deserves its own title. History begins its first great act of airbrushing. You wander the court weeks after the funeral. The stories already sound different. Bolder, cleaner. Someone claims Henry lifted a cannon with one arm during the siege of Boulogne. Another insists he composed an entire mass in Latin while simultaneously rejecting a papal decree and eating a roasted swan. He becomes a figure of divine contradiction. Hero and heretic, tyrant and titan. One day he's King Solomon, the next King Lear. His sins fade in whispers. His victories ring in brass. The truth, that lies somewhere in the contradictions. That he built a nation while breaking its hearts. That he forged a church out of spite. That he loved passionately, murdered pragmatically, and ruled with a conviction that didn't care whether it was right. Only that it was loud. Henry VIII didn't reign. He imposed. And now he is gone. But not forgotten. Because how do you forget someone who changed everything? The church, rewritten to suit his desires. Marriage transformed from sacrament to strategy. Succession, shattered and rebuilt like stained glass. Even death couldn't rob him of influence. The vacuum he left sucked in ministers, queens, lords, and opportunists. His son would rule briefly. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, would reshape the world. But the fault lines they inherited were all his. He left behind a country in the throes of reformation and grief, pride and rot. And in a way, that was the plan. He wanted to be remembered. And he was. Just not always kindly. You stepped through the cold halls of Windsor one last time. No smell now, just stone, echo, and memory. Beneath your feet, the vault holds his bones next to Jane Seymour, a wife who died before she could displease him, the perfect partner for eternity. Above ground statues are carved, books are written, and every schoolchild for the next 500 years will be told that Henry VIII was great. Not good, never that, but great. In the sense of vast, unignorable, and absolutely unforgettable. That was his triumph, and that, in the end, was his revenge.